All right, good afternoon and welcome back again, Realty Pros. We are excited to have all of you on the line with us today. And for those of you that will be listening to the video afterwards, welcome. Today, we are going to be talking about protocol, what to do and how to manage when things go awry. Hopefully, all of our transactions will be 100% successful. That's what the hope and the goal is. But we know that in reality, sometimes things happen, and we want to be able to manage in situations when things do go awry. So today we're going to be talking about the protocol. Today, if you guys have maybe a transaction that you can think of when things started to kind of unravel, if you want to submit that for discussion, then we can go ahead and peel back some layers on that as well to give you guys some insight as to what to do and how to manage in difficult situations. Okay, does anybody have a transaction in mind? If so, you can go ahead and think about it, unmute yourselves, take a moment. But in the meantime, I will go ahead and just say for you guys, the best defense is to do everything by the book. And when things start to get a little difficult in a transaction, document everything, okay? We talked about in our conversation with Curtis last week, as we use that, as an example of sometimes when you're dealing with a difficult, agent on the other side of the transaction, how not to get into the tit for tat, how not to get into the emotional exchange, but to be the true professional and get that transaction to settlement for your clients, okay? That being said, oftentimes it's not even necessary to go back and forth in email exchange if that's going to be a heated exchange. There's certain elements of the contract in and of itself that will simply effectuate whatever changes are needed in your transaction, and that is the only way to do so within the contract, okay? So from that perspective, you want to make sure that if you are in a transaction where things start to get a little hairy, make sure you're using your contract documents and everything that you submit to that other agent. Make sure that you temper your tone and everything. Before you send a text or before you send an email, read it, reread it, and make sure that if it was ever in the front page of the Washington Post, it would make you, your client, your company, your business look good. All right. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts before we continue in that line of conversation? Mr. Porter, I see you unmuted yourself. Go ahead.
Yeah, I hope you guys can hear me.
Yes.
I was going to say that it is very important for you guys, for us all to remember that our professionalism is always being monitored. Even when you're, in a transaction and you feel it's just you and the other agent having a conversation, you never know who might be listening on the other line. You never know who this person may be or who they may know. And so you just always want to be professional at all times. You want to always stick to your training, the things that we train on. You got to always remember that other agents are not necessarily trained. They may have a real estate license, but they may not have been given a lot of the information that you benefit from here at Porterhouse. So you have to, and we said this before, take the lead, and you have to sometimes impart the information. I always take the lead in the transaction whenever I get ratified or have a ratified contract. I take the lead. But that being said, when things do go awry, you want to slow down. You want to start to call your broker, call me, call your accountability partner, call some of the other agents who have expertise in different areas and get advice. So you want to slow down, and then if it's verbal, you want to keep it verbal as much as possible. If it's in writing, if it gets to that point where you feel like they're sliding off and it started to be in writing, you want to document what is being said to you, but you want to be careful what you put in writing. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that.
Very well stated, Mr. Porter. as you know, some conversations, as Curtis elaborated on last week with the other agents, some conversations can get a little bit hairy or a little bit heated when you're dealing with a difficult party on the other side of the transaction. But like Mr. Porter said, you want to, if those things are in conversation, you want to mitigate your responses. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and reiterate, you document what is being transmitted on the other side and you monitor what you say and what you send back, okay? Because at every time you are representing yourself as a realtor, the boards that you're associated with, your client, the brokerage that you're associated with, yourself as a professional, the industry, and there's so many layers that are involved with that, okay? There are a couple things that I have in mind just right offhand that we can just kind of sift through as it pertains to things that, you know, when they go awry, you want to make sure that you have all of your ducks in a row. Okay. Every now and again, you'll have a client that may be disgruntled because something didn't go their way. 9.9 times out of 10, you won't. You won't have to deal with that because we're going to service them so well that they're going to be happy and raving fans about Porterhouse. But in the event of one of the situations that I can think of right offhand with a buyer client who defaulted and, you know, we represent the seller chose not to return that buyer's client, the buyer's earnest money deposit. So now the buyer, you know, they're going through a whole list of accusations against not just the seller, but the brokerage and the agent and so forth and the lender. And it's everybody's fault that the buyer defaulted on this contract. So in that type of instance, what are some things that you guys would think to do to be able to shield yourself and to continue to be the consummate professional that you are? Tell me what you guys think. If you're in the midst of a situation, you're representing the seller, the buyer has defaulted, the seller is choosing to keep their earnest money deposit. Now the buyer is filing a complaint against you, against the company, against the lender, against the seller, against everybody because they have defaulted on the contract. Tell me some thoughts that come to mind and some things that you would think to do or not do.
Well, for me, because I was actually going to ask this, um, one thing I know that I would do right away is contact my broker and let her know that everything is getting a little crazy and what is my next step. Um, what I wanted to know was when you're in a situation like that, um, is it proper to just not respond? That was my question.
So that is a great question, Dee, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Mr. Porter, I see that you've unmuted yourself. Did you have something you wanted to share?
No, I was gonna say, B, that's an excellent question. And so let me just kind of put a little. I'm gonna give you guys a little bit of perspective. In addition to remembering that we're always professional. Remember that we have ethics that we uphold, NAR, the board, and just being good people here at Porterhouse. We want to always do good business. We do represent our client. Okay. If you all remember your new agent orientation training, one of the things that we taught you was one of our core values is disclose, disclose, disclose. Okay, so if you've already disclosed everything, you have nothing to hide. So you shouldn't be trying to hide or cover up anything. And we need to make sure that we distinguish between confidentiality and what I would call a cover up. We're not covering up anything. The relationship that we represent is always between the buyer and the seller, period. Relationship that we represent is always between the buyer and the seller. We're doing a transaction on behalf of the buyer or the seller, and the transaction is between the buyer and the seller. You are the go-between person. So you are transferring information back and forth, and that is the sum total of how you have to keep everything in perspective. And that being said, going back to your point, D, just think about if it all ends up not in even a mediation, because that's where it normally ends up first. But if it has to go to a legal place, just remember, when they give you those Miranda rights, they say you have a right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. So in other words, whatever you're saying, you're hurting yourself. That's what that is warning you. We're going to twist your words. We're going to take every word. We're going to scrutinize it. We're going to analyze it, and we're going to turn it to make you look bad. So when it gets to a point, you start to minimize and do. You said the first thing, the most important thing is reach out to your broker. Once you reach out to your broker, we'll figure out where we are within that situation. We'll decide which way to go. If we want to have verbal communications, if it's time for us to start documenting. When I say documenting, making sure that whatever they say, we want to document. And we want to say, so are you saying? You want to make sure you're documenting what they say. Now, what you say, you want to be very careful of what you say at that point. And that's what we want you to be thinking about. Because if it does get down to the attorney is going to want to know what we said. Not what they said, what we said. How did we respond? And we want to make sure that we keep it between the buyer and seller, first and foremost, because that's our job. We don't want to get emotionally involved, take anything personal or start to act out of our professional character. And then if we feel as though it's crossing certain lines, we want to make sure that we're documenting in writing what the other person is saying, and not necessarily making statements or claims or promises on your own behalf, because you represent the buyer or the seller anyway. And that's what we want you to be mindful of. I don't know if that answered your question, D, so you can.
So
Those were very good points. Go ahead, Dee.
So I did get some good information from that. Basically, it is okay to remain silent and talk to your broker or your owner or your team lead or your accountability partner to get some pointers about which way to go, but especially your broker, because as we all should know, if anything goes wrong, the broker's responsible. So the first person that should know that things are happening is your broker. My other question, I think, because I said, is it all right to remain silent? And I'm hearing it's a negotiation between the buyer and the seller. So you should be representing the buyer and the seller. The other thing is to be professional. So when you're speaking of being professional, then my thought is that you should not convey to your client that things are getting untoward. You should be taking out the pertinent information and making sure that they know that, so they're responding to what needs to be done as opposed to the emotion of the situation. I had a situation where the client was not happy with the fact that they were not made aware that the representative of the other client was getting a bit out of hand, and they were put off by the fact that I did not share that information, and I felt that that was not my place as a professional. And so I that's why my question is it okay to remain silent? And where how much do you share with your client when the other rep is getting crazy?
Well, Well, D, here's now and I want to ask a deeper question. When you say your client was upset with you because you didn't disclose to them that the agent was becoming unruly?
That's correct. That's what I said.
Okay. So, well, you don't want to talk to your client about your colleague. Believe it or not, that person is your colleague. Okay. So, because we're in the opposite transaction, we're still realtors. We're still governed by the National Association of Realtors. We don't say anything about another realtor to besmirch their reputation or their character or anything, even if they are quote unquote acting crazy. We don't disclose that to anybody. We'll deal with that at the end of the transaction if it becomes a situation where we feel as though the board needs to know what's going on. If it's something so egregious, then we can let the board know in the midst of the transaction, but that's something that the broker needs to make a decision with the attorneys and all of that. But your job is to make sure that your client stays focused on their goal of either purchasing or selling their property. And all of the quote unquote things that the person may be doing that are crazy. Give me an example of what you said, just an example for this purpose of what something that you think was crazy that the agent was doing that the client wanted you to convey.
Well, in this situation, the agent swore up and down that I had made an error and said that I should be fired. And I was not going to share any of that with my client. I wanted to talk about what needed to be done, and I tried to get there, and that did not happen. They got stuck on the transmission of information that was slow in happening.
So yeah, that's something that if it's an error on your part as the agent, if it's something that we made a mistake, then that's something that the broker needs to know right away, so that we can figure out the best way to resolve it without injuring our client anyway. So that's something that you definitely want to bring to a broker. If you feel as though you might have made a mistake, you want to bring that to the broker immediately or have the broker intervene. And if there's communication that needs to be had between between you and your client in reference to that situation, depending on what it is, because if it's going to cost them some money, they got to know. If it's going to possibly cost them the deal, then we have to disclose it. But let the broker make that decision for you.
Great answer and great question, Dee. I want to answer another part of your question as well, because I want to make sure that we're clear when you say, is it okay not to respond? As it pertains to, accusations and, defamation and the other agent being unruly, it is okay not to respond to that type of conversation.
And that was the question. Is it okay to not to respond to that? Okay, great.
Yes, so if an agent is being rude and what they're asking or presenting to you has nothing to do with furthering the transaction, but their conversation is just, divisive and it's accusatory and all of those things, it is okay to not respond to that type of language. Okay, if somebody's going to attack you and accuse you and all those things, like Mr. Porter said, even, outside of real estate, if something were to happen, people are Mirandaized and they say you have the right to remain silent. So when you get into a situation like that, you don't even have to say a word. You just make sure that you're doing everything on behalf of your client that you need to be doing, and everything for yourself as a professional and your brokerage to make sure that you're well represented, everything is documented, and everything is done by the books. Okay, great question and great input, Mr. Porter. Does anybody else have any thoughts or?
That being said, I wanted to make sure that I say one thing just so we can be perfectly clear. when those people are saying those things about you, D, or saying, if it's verbal or, by the phone, you want to write it down. You want to write down the time, the day, what the person said, any quotes they made, any statements they made, etc., just for your own documentation. All right. Just in case you ever do need it, you should have a little log book when you're having conversations, or you can do it through Boomtown now. You can log the phone call and write down your notes, what was said, and all of those things in case, just in case it ever is needed again. Hopefully, it's just rhetoric, or they're being unprofessional in the heat of the moment. And once the transaction is over, it's over. But you want to make sure that you keep track of, those type of things. You don't have to respond, though. And it takes a lot of discipline to not respond. And so that's what we want to say to you guys. It takes a lot of discipline to not respond, but we don't want you to respond to those type of things, even though they feel personal. You don't know this person from a can of paint, may never work with them on the transaction again. It's not worth your license, it's not worth your career, it's not worth mediation, it's not worth court, it's not worth the money, the time, the effort. It's just not worth it. You're trying to get through the transaction for your client to close that deal. So you have to have tough skin.
So
that's what we're trying to convey.
Okay. But it's also important to look at what they're saying if it's in writing, or hear what they're saying if it's verbally. If there is a piece of information that pertains to the transaction that needs to be handled, that I think is that was the other thing that I got from what you all are saying, that piece.
Exactly. So most of us here are Marylanders, and if we have Marylanders, we eat crabs. So when you cut that crab open, you're gonna go through a whole lot of shell just to get a little bit of meat. All you're concerned about is that little bit of meat. What is pertinent to this transaction? What is what you really want to hear from that other agent is, what is your client conveying? Not what you're saying, but what is your client conveying? And I even had a situation. I'll just share this with you just real quick, because I think Curtis might be able to chime in on his recent transaction. I had a client, an agent one time, and they were saying my client's not going to do that. And I said, well, I just shared with you that my buyer wanted this. So how can you know that your client's not going to do it if you have not spoken to the client? Are you the client on the transaction? And they said, no, but I know. I said, well, you can't tell me what you know. You have to ask your client what they want to do, and then call me back. And when they went and asked the client was agreeable. So that's what I wanted to say.
Excellent. And let's just be clear, when we're talking about not responding and we're talking about things that we're shielding the client from, we're talking about insult, attacks, unprofessionalism on part of the agent per se. We're not talking about things that pertain to the transaction and things that could affect the success of the client's transaction there. Okay. Anita, I see you unmuted yourself, and Curtis too. So you guys go ahead and jump in.
Yes, I wanted to say also too, well, all of probably what I'm saying has been said, but the thing that I got, the most important thing that you can do is to make sure, don't be so anxious to get what you think is a quote unquote ratified contract. Make sure that the contract is in fact ratified, that your contract is complete, so that helps you to not have to have a lot of additional words if it comes down to it, because the contract speaks for itself. And then also too, something else that, because we all make mistakes, that's just, because we're human beings, but we have to also know that our brokerage is going to be there for us. They're going to be there to support us, to back us up, so that if we do find ourselves in the situation where there has been a mistake that has been made, the importance of going to them, they're, more aware of what we're going to be able to do to rectify the situation and make sure that, you know, the transaction goes as we intended it to go, and that the least amount of damage is done. And so I think that's an important thing also. And then, I mean, for me, I've had several occasions where the other agent, whether I was on the buyer side or the seller side, I mean, everyone wants what they want. Everyone wants what they want. And so, you know, and so people sometimes do get impatient, and sometimes, unfortunately, maybe act or respond in a way that is not beneficial at all. But there's been several transactions that I've had issues with the other agent, and my client never knew, you know, that there were things that were going on in the background. And just like Mr. Porter said, you just have to not take it personally, although, you know, it's an attack on your person, and so you want to, but, you know, you just have to not take it personally. And even if something that they've said, if, you know, is accurate about maybe something that went on in the transaction, I guess at that point, that's just where you're able to learn from your mistake.
Very
Excellent
great.
point, Anita. And I'm gonna let Curtis go, but I do want to say one thing, Anita. Very important. Mistakes can be made by anybody at any time. What we try to provide you guys with is what we call success tools, right? Training is one big success tool, and just being able to communicate with each other and talk about these scenarios is very important to give you insight, because everybody does different kinds of transactions. You want to try to make sure that your transaction is pretty much boring. That's what I want to say. You want to get from point A to point B with as little excitement as possible until you get to the closing table. Right? That's a great transaction for me. When it gets a little excited, you want to be the calm in the storm. Okay, well, let's get through. You say, okay, I hear you. Let me talk to my client. I'll get back with you. That's it. After they can say anything they want. And guys, I don't know, maybe I got a tough skin. I used to be a school principal in Southeast. I've been called everything but a child of God, literally. It's okay with me. Let's get to the end of the day. That's what I'm trying to get to, close the transaction. And so I'm going to keep my client shielded. I'm going to push through. I'm going to overcome obstacles. I'm going to go around, over, under, whatever I have to do. And I know Curtis has something that he wanted to share. And I also want Darlene to share something that she just got a call about, where the person tried to kind of, I guess, use the leverage of her needing an extension to try to get some information from me, how Darlene managed that. So Curtis, go ahead, and then Darlene, you can go.
Sure, yeah. I just wanted to just jump in quick and, you know, with the recent transaction that I had, when things started to go a little sour with the other agent, I didn't lose sight of the goal, which was my clients selling their home. And I didn't go silent with the agent. I just stopped entertaining the dialogue that had nothing to do with closing the deal. And that's why I personally reached out to the actual title company we're working with. I reached out personally to the lender that was involved in the transaction with the buyers. And from that kind of interaction, I knew the buyers clearly wanted the home, and everything was still moving right along, regardless of the buying agent having their feelings and whatever they were dealing with. At the end of the day, I'm going to close the transaction, and I'm not going to let anything, you know, kind of like really knock me off of that trajectory. And I knew my sellers wanted to sell. They were happy with everything that was in the contract. And all I did was just make sure that we got it across the line, that we closed it. And all of the hoopla that happened in the transaction, now it's all, it's all behind me. It's all over. And I'm actually getting ready to go in the Columbia Mall. I'm gonna go buy myself a pair of shoes. So the transaction closed. That's all that matters. On to the next one. And I'm not, don't let anybody out here get you off, rock you off your, off your trajectory. We don't get paid if we don't close. So they can say and do whatever. As long as we keep things moving along, you can say whatever you want to say, but you're going to eat too. Like, you're going to get paid too. So you can say whatever you want. I'm going to close this thing out and keep it moving. I just wanted to say that. Just want to say that.
And that's Curtis. Curtis, that's why they call it a settlement. It's all settled when it's settled.
There you go.
So, all of that other stuff, really all of the stuff in the middle doesn't matter once it's settled. And if there is residue, this is what we're trying to make sure you guys are protected from, because sometimes it is settled, but that other agent might have an issue or may want to make something out of it, because just because it's settled don't mean that it's over. All right, but it's settled. We closed, we got our clients, they're happy. Now we can deal with each other if there's something to deal with each other about. And that's what we are supposed to do. That's our fiduciary. So that being said, Darlene, I want you to share, and then I think Jasmine has something else.
While Darlene is in the process of unmuting herself, I want to reiterate something that Curtis just said, because that was crystal clear. Curtis said, I didn't stop responding to the agent. I just stopped entertaining the hoopla, or something to that effect. So everything that is specific to moving that transaction along is what we are telling you guys. You respond to that. You don't respond to all of the nonsense. So I really appreciate the way that you put it there, keeping that goal in mind to get to settlement for your client. And as Mr. Porter is alluding to, you don't want to allow anything that happens between the agents in the transaction to ever affect the success of your transaction with your seller or your buyer, because you represent the parties to the transaction. The agents should never get in the way of that. So your primary objective is to close that transaction successfully for your client. So whatever that means, if it means you're biting a hole in your lip, or, holding your hands down from responding, whatever that looks like, your primary objective is what's in the best interest of my client. And closing that transaction, keeping your client's goal in mind, is exactly what that is.
And Jasmine, that was beautiful what you just said, but I wanted to just say it this way. You only represent yourself to get the client. You only represent yourself to get that client, to get that listing. You're representing yourself to get that listing. You're selling yourself to get that person to allow you to sell their home. You're representing yourself to get that buyer to allow you to help them purchase their home or that property or that investment. But once you have that agreement, you no longer represent yourself, and that's where agents get in trouble. They continue trying to represent themselves in the transaction, and they should not be. They should be then representing their client. And that's where you got to change the focus. Once you have that agency agreement, you are not representing yourself anymore. You are representing your client.
Therefore, everything that you communicate. Perfect. That was perfectly stated, Mr. Porter. Therefore, everything that you communicate in that transaction is on behalf of your client. So it's not agent to agent going head to head. This is what my buyer is communicating to the seller. The seller is communicating this to the buyer. It's between the buyer and the seller only at all times, not between the agents.
So another question.
And let D, before you get to that, D, I'm sorry. I want to give you I want to give you all the images that we have so that you guys can use it. So consider yourself a store, right? you got the front end of the store. So what I'm saying is when you represent, you can be as friendly and nice and wholesome to the other colleague, to the agent on the other side of that transaction. That's the front end of your store. The back end of your store, though, says, I'm representing my client, and that's the purpose. So if things start to shift where they don't like the front end of your store anymore, you continue to be cordial, but you want to then get into the back end of your store, which is what you're really there to do. I'm really here to represent my client. I was just being nice. We had coffee. I thought we could get along. I was trying to recruit you, but that's not important. What's important is you represent your client, I represent mine. And so if that front end of the store goes away, that's fine. Represent the back end of your store. Back end of your store is you represent that client, but you always put on the friendly face and the wonderful personality and all of those things. But keep let them know at the end of the day, you got teeth for your client, not for yourself in the transaction. Go ahead, D.
So, I'm sorry Darlene isn't isn't on here right now, isn't talking with us right now. But my another question that I had is listening to Curtis.
I'm back. I'm
Oh,
back.
okay. So, do you, Mr. Porter, did you want Darlene to talk about her incident first?
Incident?
No,
Which one?
Darlene, I'll fill you in a second. Go ahead, D. Finish
Okay.
your story.
Okay. So, listening to Curtis say that he talked to the title company and the lender um, reminds me that that's what I went through during this situation that I was having with the other agent. And from talking to the title company and the lender, I understood that the buyers weren't ready to buy. They weren't actually ready to do the deal yet. And as a result, uh, my assumption is as a result, I was getting accused of doing all these things to hold things off when they really actually wanted to hold things off. When you are in a situation like that, how do you, well, I know how Mrs. Porter proceeded, so maybe maybe you should talk about how you proceeded in that situation. But for somebody who is really nice, as always, people always tell me I'm always nice and professional, how do you handle a situation when you know what's going on the other side, but you don't represent them and you're not supposed to do it, you're not supposed to communicate it with them at all, but the agent is running interference that is actually slowing down the process?
So that's a great question, Dee, and I would love to just share a little bit of insight. You know how you hear Mr. Porter say, take the lead in every transaction that you're doing? That's exactly what you want to do. If you know that there are things going on, as an example for the transaction that Dee's talking about, very much like what Curtis did, you reach out to the lender, you reach out to the title company, you reach out to the other buyer, and remember, you can't get to settlement without them. You need the other agent, you need the buyer, you need the lender, you need the title company, you need all of these parties. So in that leadership aspect, you're going to reach out to them and establish a rapport. And oftentimes that's going to mean sometimes you're having conversations with them, sometimes you may be counseling them, but at the end of the day, your goal is to refocus them on getting to settlement, because settlement is in the best interest of your client. So whatever you got to go through in order to, peel back those layers and refocus them on settlement, sometimes you're going to have to, kind of make sure there's no stone left unturned in terms of figuring out options and solutions that will work well for both parties. So giving that agent a call, giving the title company a call, giving the lender a call, and refocusing everybody. And I remember the transaction that Dee's talking about so well, because that transaction, unlike most of the, the kind of interference that I have to do, that one probably cost me the most time. Thanks, Dee. But that one was very much refocusing the lender, refocusing the agent. ensuring that they were working towards the same goal with getting to settlement, because that is what was in the best interest of our seller that was working for Porterhouse. So refocus them. Don't entertain any of the shenanigans, if you will. Refocus them on the goal. And when they see your crystal clear-eyed focus on settlement, it will help them to focus on settlement. I remember that transaction. They were fearful that the buyer was going to lose his earnest money deposit and all these different things. And the sobering conversation was, if we get to settlement for both clients, then the earnest money deposit is not a part of the conversation. The earnest money deposit becomes the first part of that buyer's down payment and equity into their house. It is not something that is a matter of the seller taking or keeping. If we're focused on settlement, then why are we focused on the buyer losing their earnest money deposit? The only way that becomes a part of the focus is if the buyer is planning to default in some way. So let's work together to see what we need to do so that the buyer is able to fully perform according to the terms of the contract, so that there is no issue that would cause the buyer to be fearful about losing their earnest money deposit. So having to go through the situation and redirect and refocus their attention is exactly what got us to settlement in the transaction that Dee is referencing.
So I want to also, Jasmine, just to chime in, when we started today's Realty Talk, you guys were talking briefly about travel and, flights being smooth and all of those things. And so I remember in our early days, when I was training Curtis, when he was a very new agent, one of the terms I used to use was crash landing. And I don't know if Curtis remember, I used to tell him, say, hey, we got to get this thing ratified that's getting up in the air. We got to maneuver through, to get it to where it's supposed to be. And we got to land at the residence. And the buyer and seller are happy that the residence is transacted, and that's the landing. And I said that sometimes it's a smooth landing, and other times it's going to be a crash landing. Either way, we want to make sure that the parties are safe. Okay, that's our job. Get them there as safely as possible, and to do everything that we can professionally to make sure that they arrive safe and unharmed. Now, that being said, there are going to be situations that pop up, and that's just doing your due diligence, calling the lender, calling the title company to verify information that you're receiving. That's just doing your due diligence. That's just basic professionalism. You don't, you don't really want to listen to a lot of conversation per se in real estate. You want to verify with people. You want to see their assets. You want to see their credit. You want to see their income. You want to see their spreadsheet, any documentation that they can provide to let you know that the things that they're saying are verified. You want to see the lender's report. You want to hear from the title company. Are we ready for title? Is everything coming? You want to gather all of that information so that you can then say, hey, the information that you shared doesn't line up with all of the other documentation and information that we have. So I'm going to lean in favor of the fact that we're still moving forward. And that's what you want to continuously do. That's just doing your due diligence. And then when things pop up, well, there's a credit score changed, or we forgot to add this fee, and the buyer doesn't have this much. Well, that's when it starts to crash land a little bit. But we do what we can to make sure that we get our clients that land, or get rid of that land as smoothly as possible, even if it means that we have to take something out of what we're willing to sacrifice in order for them to get what they have to get so that we can move on to the next transaction.
I see. So again, I heard you all talking about making sure you do your due diligence. In all of that, do you reach out to the other agent's client? I thought that was something we were not to do. Okay, so we're not to do that.
No.
Okay.
No. Now, that being said, there have been times when the agent gives you express written consent to talk directly to their client. That express written consent. And even when they do that, I'm still a little nervous about doing it, but sometimes the agent relationship with the client is more of a hands-off. The client wants to handle the situation, and they don't even want to talk through the agent. They want to be more hands-on. So the client will say to you, the agent will say to you, you have my express written consent to deal directly with my client and communicate with them around this transaction. Just keep me in the loop, or something of that nature. But have that in writing, and then make sure that you bring it to your broker before you start to engage that client, but you should not be talking to the other client.
So thank you for sharing that, Mr. Porter. And Dee, thanks for asking that question. I want to make sure that everybody's crystal clear. What Mr. Porter's talking about is the exception to the rule. If that exception happens, like he said, it's going to be through express written consent, and I would avoid it at all costs. Because remember, you don't represent that other client. So anything that you share with them is like you're opening yourself up for liability, because then that person can have all of, the leverage in the world to say, oh, well, Dee took advantage of me, or whatever the case is. So you want to allow that person to go through their representative. And just like Mr. Porter said, if the agent is hands off because they're at one of the discount brokerages where the agent potentially just put the property on the market, but they're actually not transacting on behalf of the client, and there's, express written consent for you to reach directly out to them in that regard, you make sure that you're going through that agent. All communication goes directly to the agent as well as the client, and not the client instead of the agent as well as the client, so that all parties are aware and that agent is able to advise their client however they see fit.
And that's wonderful. And Jasmine, and this I want to get to D real quick. Keep saying D, Darlene. This willing and dealing thing, be careful of that. That's not what you do. Let me give you an example. So willing and dealing. I had a client, or I have a client, and the client and his brother were purchasing a property. The brother, who was the lead on the property, could not, for some reason, something popped up with his taxes. He can no longer be the lead. So now we have to switch to the other brother to take the lead on the purchase. Well, that will push everything back by another 30 days. Okay, we disclosed it to the seller. We let him know what was going on. The seller said, okay, well, we want to increase the earnest money deposit. We want to make the earnest deposit non-refundable, and we want you to increase the purchase price by another $1,000 in order for us to ratify with the new client or with the other brother. Well, I'm not doing no willing and dealing. So I told my client exactly what that agent reported that the seller asked for. And in doing that, I told my client if they wanted to increase their earnest money deposit, that was their choice. Oh, and they wanted the earnest money deposit to be held by their title company and their brokerage. I said, if you want to increase the earnest money deposit from the original, that's your choice. If you want to increase the purchase price, that's your choice. I said, but I would highly recommend that you not agree to earnest money deposit being non-refundable, and that we maintain contingencies. Now, I want to stay ratified. That's what Shay Maurice Porter wants. But I don't represent Shay Maurice Porter. I represent my client. It's not in my client's best interest to agree to the new terms in order to get re-ratified. I told my client, this is what we're going to do. If the first contract should be dissolved, then let it be dissolved. We'll reintroduce a contract that you're comfortable with, and they can either take it or they can leave it. And if we have to go play ball somewhere else, then that's just the way the things are. But I would not recommend that you get desperate, emotionally involved in that this trade. That's just not in your best interest. They agreed. So that willing and dealing piece, I could have easily said, I think my client will be amenable. I think you don't want to ever do that. You're no longer representing your client at that point. Darlene had a situation today she called me about, and I'm glad that she handled it the way she did. And it goes to everything that we talked about today. So I guess it'd be a great piece of punctuation where they needed an extension, and the seller wanted some information for the buyer, and the timing of it seemed as though if you give me this information that's confidential information, then maybe I'll get you. It was like a willing and dealing type thing. It was almost, it just didn't, and Darlene didn't respond. She remained silent. She let things, she just was patient. Darlene, tell us what happened if you on the line.
Yeah, I'm on the line. So basically what happened was the listing agent, I asked her yesterday for the extension. She said a seller was willing. And then this morning, she sent me an email, and the email said the seller is just curious to know what the house appraised for. And I'm like, interesting. And then I read it, and then I closed it, and then I just kept doing what I was doing, because what I was looking for is if it was an attachment with this email that had a signed addendum, and it didn't. So I just closed it and I just left. And then when I went back, probably maybe around noonish or right before I call or text Mr. Porter, I saw the attachment with the signatures. And I just took the took the addendum, and then I forwarded over to, the loan officer and title company. I still haven't spoken to the person, but in my mind, I'm like, you asking me questions about what it appraised for, and you didn't send me my addendum, because that's what we should be talking about. And I still haven't spoken to the person. So that's how I dealt with it.
Exactly. So what I commended, because, okay, Darlene, that information, that appraisal, your buyer pays for that. That's your buyer's confidential information. You can't share that. That's your buyer's information. And it's not in your best interest to ask your buyer to share that information with the seller unless the house did not appraise for value. Then you want to share that report, because it's in your buyer's best interest to share the report along with a change in terms addendum to reduce the price of the property. But if you don't say nothing as the buyer's agent to the seller or to the seller's agent, they should not be asking you about the appraised value. They shouldn't even pry. And I told Darlene, you don't even have to respond to it, but if you do respond to it, I will pick up the phone and say, that I would never be able to even ask my client to share that information with you. My fiduciary is to my client. I have to represent it. It's not in their best interest. Don't have your client ask my client that kind of information, and just leave it at that. I wouldn't even put it in writing, and I would just pick a phone and say it to him and say, don't, come on.
Mr. Porter, and
that's
exactly what I said I would do.
Trained. Right. Right. Maybe she's not trained. Maybe she didn't know that she wasn't supposed to. So you got to remember, sometimes agents are new, and other times they're slick.
Yeah.
So they're going to try to get the information that they can. So we're not going to fall for that.
Yeah, no.
If she's best interest at all times.
If she emails me again, if she emails me again and asks the question again, I'm sorry I cut you off, that's when I'll give her a call. So right now I'm just acting like I didn't see it.
Yeah, and don't feel pressure. That's what I was going to say.
No.
Don't ever feel pressure. Oh, I need this extension, and they're asking me about this, or maybe if I give them this, they'll give me an extension. You would not believe how many times novice agents have made that simple mistake and have ended up not only in trouble, but blowing up the whole deal. Because once you share that information, if they realize they can get more money, guess what? That deal is over.
Yep.
You just blew
and
up
that's
your
exactly what I
deal.
thought. Yep. I'm like, yeah,
well,
no,
it doesn't even matter. Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, and you shouldn't think I don't want you to think about that. I want you to think about, I represent my clients, not my client's best interest, because that house, if the house had not appraised for value, then we would be talking. I haven't said anything, you don't say anything to me. That's how I look at it.
Hello,
Savannah
hello.
Legend, Dr. Campbell. He's
Nice
our
to
urban
meet you,
custody person.
ma'am. Can I
So that was great insight. Darlene, you handled that very well. Kudos to you guys, and thank you for everything that you shared today. We're gonna go ahead and end for today. It's 1:35. I wanna let you guys go. If anybody has any last minute thoughts, any last minute, insight or anything that you'd like to share, then you can go ahead and do so. Otherwise, we're gonna go ahead and end the recording and let you guys go.
Just wanted to let you know, like Angela had said last week, when we talk about things like this, and I get more insights about how to handle situations that are a little sticky. So I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate what Darlene said also. And the examples help you to remember what to do in certain kinds of situations.
Excellent. Anybody else? All right, guys. Well, we're going to go ahead and end for today. Our evening